So here is Brian Williams. They love revisiting Katrina, don't they? The drive-bys just love going back to that period of time because they love using Katrina to hang Republicans. And they hammer George W. Bush. And they hammer the fact Republicans don't like people. The Republicans are racist, sexist, bigot, homophobes. And so when Katrina flooded New Orleans, it was okay with the Republicans because the people that live there vote Democrat. Oh, they love to go back and talk about Katrina. But if they want to revisit Katrina, they may have to resign because it turns out a lot of what was so-called reported out of there probably was a series of big lies. And I don't doubt that for a minute. Here's Brian Williams from 2006. This is Michael Eisner, the former Disney CEO, interviewing Brian Williams. He said, your change after Katrina was clear to me. All of a sudden, it was no longer Tom Brokaw. It was you. Something must have happened down there that you were no longer in waiting to go on stage. You were the stage, Brian. What was it in New Orleans that you saw that matured a mature man?
When you look out of your hotel room window in the French Quarter and watch a man float by face down, when you see bodies that you last saw in Banda Aceh, Indonesia, and swore to yourself that you would never see in your country, I beat that storm. I was there before it arrived. I wrote it out with people who later died in the Superdome.
If they did, why didn't you take them with you? If people died in the Superdome and you didn't die in it, why did you take them with you, Brian? I've often wondered about these people like Sally Struthers. They go over to sub-Saharan Africa and they're asking us to send money for hungry people. And I'm shouting, Sally, I'm sure you brought a caterer with you there. Why don't you just feed them? Give them your pimento cheese sandwich or something. Anyway, I have to take a quick time out here, an obscene profit break, but as you always know, there's much more. Hi, how are you? Welcome back, folks. Rush Limbaugh, Open Line Friday. Meeting and surpassing all audience expectations every day. So here's the former Disney CEO interviewing Brian Williams. I don't even know what the event was, but Eisner wanted to know, so Brian, what happened, man? Your change after Katrina, man, that was clear to me. And when you got back from Katrina, man, I saw a different guy. I saw a guy who was maturing. I saw a mature guy, Brian, who he'd matured even beyond maturity. That's what Eisner said. Eisner was really laying it on and thinking, boy, Brian, I am really impressed. You go down to Katrina, you saw a bunch of suffering. You saw a bunch of destruction. How did that change you, Brian? This is so part and parcel of the ingredients necessary to be a good news reader. You have to have this myth about you that you have seen suffering, and that you can't abide it, and that when you saw suffering, you had to go into journalism so that you could call attention to the suffering, because the suffering is incomprehensible, and the suffering is insufferable, and the suffering is intolerable. And so, this is my exact point about liberalism. Okay, so you see suffering. This is why it's such an easy thing to do, to be a liberal. You see suffering, and you go where it is, and you tell people what you're seeing. In this case, he made it up, but nevertheless, you go watch people suffer. You point out how they're suffering. Then you point fingers of blame at the Republicans, if you want to put icing on the cake, and tell everybody how rotten it is, how sad it is, how unfortunate it is, and how can this possibly be in our great country? Oh my God, look at this suffering. You don't actually do a thing about it. You don't actually solve anything. You just go look at it. And then you tell people how bad it was. And you tell people how moved you were. And then guys like Michael Eisner come along and say, man, you blew me away. You've just really matured, Brian. And all of this is just play acting. It's PR. It's buzz. It's symbolism over substance. As I say, Pick your journalist and pick your episode of suffering and ask yourself, what do they do to solve it? They don't. They advance a political agenda when they see suffering. They blame their political opponents for it. They blame the Republicans, or they blame talk radio, or they blame whoever is the villain of the day. And they look at the suffering and they wring their hands and they chide all of us. How dare you allow this to happen? How dare we permit this to happen? I can't believe I'm watching this, and you and I look at that dead body floating down the river there, face down in the French Quarter, except that didn't happen. But it sounds really good. And then after I saw the dead body, oh my God, I got dysentery. Oh, geez, did I suffer too? I suffered so much when I brought you the suffering. Never mind that nothing was done. That's how you get your chops in the news. And so Eisner says, wow, man, you really, really, really impressed me when you chronicled all of that suffering. But nothing happened. And it's classic, folks. You know, I first became aware of this tactic, and that's what it is. It's a tactic, and I think it's probably taught in journalism school. I first became really aware of this tactic when I was in Sacramento. It had been 1984, 1985. It was Thanksgiving afternoon. Sacramento's in the Pacific time zone, so the football games start at 9:30 in the morning and 1:30 in the afternoon. There was no Thanksgiving night game then. So the late afternoon Thanksgiving game is at 1:30 on the left coast, which is when a lot of people are doing Thanksgiving. And the news networks that were not covering the football games all sent their local reporters to the homeless shelters. And at halftime of the football game, they cut away to local news. And they took us to the homeless shelter. Now, here are people gathered around their Thanksgiving tables. And in the middle of halftime, we get a local news story of an info babe or an anchor, a reporter at inside the homeless shelter, watching dirty, filthy, sad, homeless people being fed by the courageous standing in line at the food kitchen, and they're stuffing food in their mouths like they have not eaten in days. And the info babe or the reporter looks at us and essentially, how can you sit there in the middle of the football game and be enjoying your Thanksgiving dinner when these people a few miles away from you are suffering and are starving, and their Thanksgiving is to sit around a bunch of fellow hobos in a homeless shelter, and they guilt trip you. While you have nothing to feel guilty about, you're at home with your family or wherever you are, and you're watching a game, the halftime news cast, and that's when I first became aware of this tactic. The guilt, and it predates this. I'm just telling you when I first learned about it. I've been taking classes at the School of Liberalism all my life, and I can tell you various days I learned and had epiphanies, and this was one of them. And this is how they do it. It's where I evolved my belief that liberalism is the most gutless thing you can do. You don't have to solve anything. All you've got to do is think you're really troubled by what you're watching, and then be able to blame the right people for it. Do you know that Brian Williams' coverage of Hurricane Katrina won NBC News the coveted DuPont Columbia Journalism School Award for journalism? Did you know that? They're not going to give it back, but they won an award. This is exactly what happens. Nothing that was reported was true, or very little of it was. There certainly wasn't a dead body floating down a river in the French Quarter because there wasn't a flood in the French Quarter. But this is how it works. So they get awards for this, but they never solve anything. Never is anything ever done about any of this that we are shown. Nope, we're just blamed for it. For not caring, for not paying high enough taxes, for voting for Republicans. The Republicans are blamed because they're cold-hearted, mean-spirited extremists that only want tax cuts for the rich, that dribble. And that's how they do it. And it looks like Brian got caught in the midst of, shall we say, exaggerating a bit the suffering that he saw. And so now there are all kinds of people looking into as much video as they can find and trying to find other examples. And so the real question is going to be, what's NBC going to do? Now, in the real world, he'd already be gone. In the old real world where people really cared about their reputation, I'm talking about NBC News, cared about their reputation. If your business is the news, and if you are competing with other networks in the news, and one of the ways you try to get more viewers than everybody else is you're right, you're first, you are trusted, your news division has credibility and integrity and honesty. If you believe in all that, and that's what you tout, and this comes along, the old days, John Chancellor would not have survived this, neither would Brinkley or Huntley, but Brian's too big to fail, there's the. Now it's, as competitive, like we talked about yesterday, that the news media no longer has a monopoly like it did back in the days, Huntley, Brinkley, and Chancellor and those guys. Now they're openly competing in the news business with us here and others in the alternative media. And that competition has changed everything. Do you think the New England Patriots would bench Tom Brady if it ever is proven that he deflated the footballs? Well, then do not expect NBC News to cap Brian Williams here. It's the same thing. It's this. Doesn't matter. Integrity game, all that sort of stuff. If the Patriots would not bench Brady if he's ever found to actively orchestrated the deflation of those footballs or whatever, if he was behind Spygate, I don't care what it is. You know they would never bench Brady. They wouldn't have. The Patriots wouldn't. Then the league, would they suspend him? No. They would. The news is a game. That's my point. The news is a competitive enterprise now. They've always wanted to be immune from bottom line concerns. They've always wanted to be immune from the traditional notions of competition in business because they thought their mission was so far more important than those silly little concerns like earning a profit. Don't kid us. Profit? We're bigger than profit, they always thought. But it's just, in the era of media competition now, they're not going to allow their quarterback to be taken out of a game like this. They'll find ways. Make a prediction. Look for reports in days ahead of other anchors at other networks doing the same thing. Not to embarrass or get those other anchors in trouble, but to create the impression, hey, everybody does it. And so what? So what? Nobody got killed. Nobody died. Just a helicopter. Just some guy floating down the river. You know what happened somewhere. Even if it was in China, there was a guy that day probably floating dead down a river somewhere in the world. Okay, it wasn't New Orleans, but it happened. We all know what happens. And they'll find some example of pick an anchor. Infobabe, making the same things up or different things up about a different kind of story, and they'll try to say at NBC, everybody does it, as a way of taking the focal point away from Brian Williams. Mark my words.